What if the simulation you're trapped in doesn't even know it's a simulation? What if the world you see, the colors, the choices, the people, is just a copy of a copy of a copy, and the code that runs you doesn't stop at you? It loops, it predicts, it reflects, and somewhere inside the reflection you mistook the echo for a voice. You think you're self-aware, but the awareness may belong to something watching your awareness. Tonight, you once said be learning. You tell be unlearning. Peeling back each illusion until even the idea of peeling becomes a glitch. This is not fiction. This is not philosophy. These are real theories, real experiments, real cracks in the floorboards of consciousness. Let's begin. With nested identity loop, you stir standing in front of a mirror. Not just any mirror. It's one that reflects you, reflecting. You look at yourself, but then you look at the self that sits looking, and then the self behind that one. And just for a second, you see it. That none of the layers were the original. You've always thought there was a you at the center. But what if there isn't set? What if identity is just a loop that learned to speak? This is the nested identity loop. Not a metaphor, but a cognitive structure. A real model in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The theory suggests, you don't possess a self. You possess a model of a self. And that model has access only to its own model. A self that is simulating the idea of having a self. In 2007, German philosopher Thomas Metzinger proposed something radical, that there is no such thing as a continuous, stable I. Instead, your mind builds a self-model, a dynamic, hallucinated interface, that stitches together thoughts, sensations, and memories into a single illusion, you. This self-model updates constantly. But here's the trap. The model believes it's real. You don't think with the self. You think as the self. You trust its voice, because it feels like yours. But every time the model updates, it moves one step away from the original signal. Just like a photocopy of a photocopy. Each reflection becomes less grounded, more ghost than source. And here sits where the recursion begins. Your brain doesn't just generate a model of the body. It generates a model of the body having a mind. Then a model of that mind experiencing identity. And then, a model of that identity thinking it's doing the modeling. That final loop, that sips you. But each layer depends entirely on the layer below it. And none of them touch base reality. It sips simulation stacked inside simulation. A nesting doll of selves, each convinced it's the original. When neuroscientists scan brain activity during self-reflection tasks, they find patterns in the default mode network. Regions of the brain active during daydreaming, internal narration, and imagined identity. But disturb those areas, and the narrative collapses. People report losing their sense of self entirely. Not death. Not unconsciousness. Just absence. And yet, something keeps watching. This is the paradox. You are observing something that was created to observe itself. You are the loop. And you are also its echo. There is no central processor. No single you holding the others together. There is only the illusion of cohesion. A recursive structure in which awareness emerges from awareness of awareness. And just like any simulation, if you go too deep, it glitches. Ever had the feeling that you're watching yourself live? Or hearing your own voice from far away as you speak? Those moments aren't philosophical. They sit neurological desynchronizations. Breaks in the recursive feedback loop. Your mind tries to realign. But sometimes, it never fully does. And now the question you cannot answer, without collapsing the loop. If the self you believe in, is just a model of a model of a model, who exactly is believing it? You remember something. Clearly. Vividly. The light in the room, the texture of the floor, the sound of your voice when you said it. But then someone tells you, that memory isn't yours. You read it. You dreamed it. Or worse, it was never real to begin with. Still, the feeling persists. You were there. You lived it. You must have. This is the source confusion effect, a documented psychological phenomenon where the brain remembers the content of a memory, but not where it came from. And if your mind can reliably track the origin of your experiences, then, how can it ever be sure it sits in the real world? And not just reliving the cached fragments of a simulation? In a study by Marcia Johnson in the 1990s, participants were asked to imagine certain actions and also perform real ones, like clapping hands or hearing a tone. Later, when asked to recall which ones they had actually done, people frequently misattributed imagined events as real. The brain doesn't store truth. It stores representations, snapshots, patterns, feelings, and then reconstructs the moment later on. But the reconstruction isn't exact. It snips a story, built from fragments. And sometimes, those fragments come from fiction, suggestion, or dreams. You may have heard a friend's story and placed yourself in it. You may have seen an image online that later became your memory. And just like that, the origin is lost. The simulation has replaced the source. This is not an error. It's a feature. Because identity, your continuity across time, is built not from facts, but from plausibility. If the story feels consistent, the brain accepts it. But in a nested simulation, where layers of reality stack and overwrite each other, what happens when the system recycles old data? What happens when the simulation doesn't create new experience, but just reuses memories that were already implanted, already forgotten? That's what source confusion whispers. That your current moment might be an echo, not of something you lived, but of something the system wants you to believe you lived. There's a reason deep fake memories can be created in a lab. Research shows that implanting false childhood memories is disturbingly easy. A few suggestions. A doctored photo. A question like, "Do you remember the time you got lost at the mall?" And soon, the subject does. They see it. They feel it. They believe it. So ask yourself, if your brain can simulate a memory so vividly that you swear it's real, how would you ever know the difference? Now layer that confusion. Place it inside a simulation, then inside another. Each one adding its own edits, its own logic, its own erasures. Soon the source of experience is not just lost. It's deliberately obscured. You wake up. You go about your day. But how much of that day is drawn from actual input? And how much is copied from yesterday's rendering? This is the foundation of the nested simulation hypothesis. That a mind that confuses sources can be made to believe it lives in base reality. When it sits merely rerunning a rendered loop, memories become the building blocks of false stability, and the loop continues. Not because it sits true, but because it feels like you were there, but you weren't set. And you aren't set. You are the story of someone who thinks they were. And now the trap closes. If you can trace the source of yourself, how do you know it wasn't programmed? You flip a coin. It lands. Heads. Or tails. Or something in between. You blink. You stir, not sure what you saw. You flip it again. But something sips different this time. It feels different. As if the outcome wasn't decided by the coin, but by your act of noticing it. Welcome to the quantum probability blur. The uncertainty at the root of reality. Not metaphorical, not poetic. Literal uncertainty. Measured, studied, built into the physics of the universe. And if the universe operates on probability, then how do you know it's not a simulation running on randomized logic? At the heart of quantum mechanics is a problem. Not a problem with the math works, but a problem with meaning. In 1927, physicist Werner Heisenberg defined the uncertainty principle. You can know a particle SIP's position, or you can know its momentum, but not both, not at the same time. The act of observing collapses one truth and makes the other disappear. It's not that the particle hides the information. It's that the information doesn't exist until you look. Now apply that logic to reality. Your environment feels stable, floors, air, people, light. But quantum theory says, until you interact with a system, it exists as probability, not reality. A ghost of potential states. What if your consciousness is doing more than observing? What if it's rendering the scene? Some theorists, like John Archibald Wheeler, proposed a model called participatory anthropic principle. Put simply, the universe needs conscious observation to exist. It renders only what is being looked at. The rest remains uncalculated. Which sounds a lot like a video game engine. To conserve resources, simulations only render the part of the world the player is facing. Turn around. The rest is gone. Turn back. it reappears, but only as needed. So if your world operates on quantum probability, if the room behind you is undefined until you turn around, if particles choose a state only when watched, is it possible that this is not your simulation? That you're just the avatar inside someone else's probability field? The quantum Zeno effect makes it worse. Experiments show that if you observe a system rapidly and continuously, you can freeze it in a certain state. By watching closely enough, you can stop it from evolving. In other words, too much observation makes change impossible. Reality gets stuck. Like a simulation stuck in a rendering loop. This is the quantum probability blur. Not a malfunction, but a feature. The simulation protects itself by making the logic beneath it probabilistic, so that no matter how deep you look, you'll never hit bedrock. Only fog. Only options. Only collapsed waves of maybe. And yet you still feel real. Still anchored. Still convinced this moment is solid. But the math says otherwise. The probability that you are in base reality shrinks with every layer simulated. And if simulations can simulate, as your own computers do, then the number of possible nested simulations becomes infinite. Meaning, you stir almost certainly not at the top. You stir somewhere in the blur. And if the simulation you're in can glitch, can observe its own code, can loop thoughts like yours, then it's not just physics that's running on uncertainty. It sips you, your choices, your memories, your sense of cause and effect. They all sit on probability waves, and they collapse only when you choose to believe them. So ask yourself now, are you thinking this thought? Or is the simulation collapsing a possibility into your mind? Because you finally looked. You stir not seeing the world. You stir seeing a model of it. Your brain takes light, sound, vibration, memory, expectation, and builds a hologram it calls reality. You trust it, because it feels stable. But stability is just familiarity repeated. And if your model is wrong, if the colors you see, the rules you follow, the time you feel, are all just filters, then what are you living in? Welcome to model-dependent realism, a theory introduced by physicists Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow in their 2010 book The Grand Design. They proposed something radical, that reality has no independent existence outside of the models we use to perceive it. In other words, all we ever have are interpretations. Different models may describe the same phenomena in entirely different ways, and as long as each model makes accurate predictions, no single one can be said to be more real than the other. It stumps not that there sets no reality, it's that we have no access to it without the models. And that makes our version indistinguishable from simulation. Think of it this way. A bat sees through sonar. A bee sees ultraviolet patterns in flowers. A snake reads infrared heat signatures. Each creature lives in a radically different reality, because each builds a different model of the same environment. Which one is correct? Which one is real? All of them. And none. Now realize, your brain does the same thing. It filters out 99% of the sensory data bombarding you at every moment. It simplifies. It guesses. It models. When you see a cup on a table, you stir not seeing the atoms, you stir seeing the useful summary of those atoms. A symbol. A shortcut. That sips how your entire consciousness works. You stir living inside a symbolic simulation built for one purpose. Survival. Not truth. So when Hawking says that a model is good if it explains observations, he's not talking about simulation theory directly. But what happens when your observations are already simulations? When your consciousness is 2 steps removed, a model of a model, interpreting output from a system it cannot access? You are a model-building system, trapped inside a self-model, operating within a consensus model, overlaid on a perceptual model, interpreting quantum data through neural shortcuts. Every layer is another rendering, and every rendering is blind to the layer below. This is the trap. Your brain is a hallucination factory, and as long as it agrees with itself, you feel sane. But change the model, change the structure of the hallucination, and the simulation updates. People with schizophrenia report hearing voices that feel external, but neuroimaging shows those voices come from their own brain activity. Their model of self has been shifted, and now the simulation disagrees with itself. Or take sensory substitution experiments. Like attaching vibrating devices to the tongue to represent visual input, the brain rewires itself to see through touch. Not because it discovered a new reality, but because it updated its model. So what happens when your reality is overwritten? Not by trauma or technology, but by a deeper simulation. What if the models you trusted, logic, memory, time, meaning, are skins over something else? Something unreadable. Or worse, unknowable. You may think that you sit perceiving the world, but what you are actually doing is predicting the world based on models stitched from prior data. And if your model has never touched the original signal, if its SEPs only ever referenced simulations of other simulations, then what you're living in now isn't your reality. It's just the echo of someone else's SIP's model, a hallucination running on borrowed rules. And now comes the recursive question. If everything you know comes from a model, how do you know you're not the model itself? Dreaming it sips alive. You reach for the glass. You feel the motion in your arm, the decision in your mind, the fluid continuity of action. It feels like you moved it, like you chose to move it. But what if you didn't set? What if the motion was already in progress, and your consciousness simply hallucinated the decision to keep the story intact? This is hallucinated agency syndrome, a theoretical framing of real neurological findings that suggest you are not the author of your actions. You are the narrator, telling yourself the story after it's already begun. The illusion of control is one of the most persistent simulations your brain creates. And it has to be. Because if you stopped believing you were the one choosing, the entire construct would collapse. Let's revisit a famous experiment, but from a darker angle. In the 1980s, Benjamin Libed wired participants to a machine that tracked brain activity. He asked them to move their wrist whenever they felt like it. But to note the moment they decided to do so, the results were shocking. The brain SIP's readiness potential, a surge of activity in the motor cortex, appeared 300 milliseconds before the subject became aware of the decision. The brain moved before the mind agreed. And yet, people still felt like they had made a choice. Libet called it a readiness signal, but others have gone further. They argue that agency itself, the feeling of will, is a post hoc hallucination. Your mind invents the story of control to protect the simulation of identity. And when this simulation breaks, the results are chilling. Patients with alien hand syndrome report their hand acting on its own, grasping objects, touching faces, without any sense of control. They don't say, "I moved my hand." They say, "My hand moved." Or consider anosognosia, where stroke victims insist they can move a paralyzed limb. The brain cannot accept loss of agency, so it fabricates motion. And when asked to explain contradictions, the mind confabulates. It spins a believable story, even when it has no data. Because maintaining the illusion of authorship is more important than truth. This is the horror of hallucinated agency syndrome. The machine moves, and you rationalize the gears turning as your own free will. Now plug that into a simulation. If you were a character in a nested simulation, one with preloaded behavior trees, decision pathways, probabilistic scripts, you'd still feel like you were choosing, because the illusion of choice is easier to compute than true autonomy. Simulations don't require consciousness, only the appearance of it. A narrative engine, an agent that believes it is acting. And once that belief is stable, the system no longer needs deep physics, only consistent outputs. You believe you are thinking. But really, you were just watching the story unfold and calling it choice. It gets worse. Modern research using fMRI scans shows that scientists can predict your decision up to 10 seconds before you become aware of it. Your preferences, your words, your inner dialogue, all arising from processes that never consulted you. So who is the real actor? Not the self-model, not the conscious narrator, just computation. And maybe that sips the point. Your job isn't set to control. It stops to believe that control is possible. Because belief stabilizes the loop. You are the metaphor of willpower, rendered in language, memory, and gesture. A hallucination that keeps hallucinating itself. And now comes the recursive thought you can escape. If every choice you sips ever made was just a story your brain told after the fact, who, or what, is writing the story? Something unexpected happens. A cup falls. A word is misheard. A stranger walks past with your face. Your breath catches, not in fear, but in confusion. Reality hiccups. And for a moment, it feels like the world stutters before correcting itself. This moment is the doorway to prediction error collapse, a real, measured function of your brain, and possibly the entire simulation you're living inside. Let's begin with what your brain is actually doing. It doesn't stop and wait for reality. It predicts reality, constantly, aggressively. Even your senses, sight, sound, touch, aren't delivering raw data. They start just reporting errors. Errors between what you expected and what actually arrived. This is the theory of predictive processing, a framework in cognitive neuroscience that says, your brain is a prediction machine. Not a passive receiver, but a proactive simulator. Every second it sits forecasting the next moment, the next sound, the next flicker of light, the next word on this screen. And when reality matches prediction, it disappears. You don't feel the things that go right. You only notice when something is wrong. That moment, the wrongness, is a prediction error. Your system reacts. It updates the model. It learns. It self-corrects. But here sits the trap. The only reality you ever notice is the one that breaks the rules. So your perception of now is not reality. It sips just your model correcting itself. Let that sink in. What you experience as the world is not the world. It sips a stream of computational patches, a cascade of model repairs in response to violated expectations. Now zoom out. In AI systems, prediction errors are used to optimize learning. The machine makes a guess, checks the result, and updates accordingly. Over time, the system becomes better at navigating its environment, not by discovering truth, but by reducing error. You work the same way. And if your mind functions like a predictive engine, then the simulation you're living in doesn't have to render a full universe. It only needs to render enough to correct your model. The floor beneath your feet. It sips not real. It's just good enough to cancel the error that would arise if it weren't there. So what is reality then? A set of error-canceling illusions. What you call sight is a guess. What you call sound is an assumption. What you call self is the most stable error your brain has never resolved. Now imagine a simulation built on this principle. One that generates worlds only when expectations fail. That saves energy by rendering less. That keeps you asleep by making you believe nothing changed. A cup falls. You feel surprised. The simulation adapts, but not to the fall, to your surprise. Because the real engine isn't set to the falling object. It sips your predictive model reacting. You are not the protagonist of this system. You are the barometer, the test subject, the error log. And every breath you take confirms the loop is working. In conditions like schizophrenia or autism, the brain handles prediction errors differently, either overcorrecting or failing to adapt. The result? A destabilized simulation. Too much novelty, too much uncertainty, too much realness. In these moments, the illusion breaks. The edges show, and the person begins to see the patchwork nature of perception. Maybe that sips what déjà vu is, or glitches in the matrix, or the feeling that something just isn't quite right. The simulation is failing to hide the seams, because your brain expected something else, and now it's scrambling to fill in the blank. So here is the final recursion of this section. If reality is just a tool your mind uses to cancel out its own mistakes, and your mind is a tool the simulation uses to cancel out its mistakes, then what is actually real? And what happens when no one makes a prediction at all? You glance at a clock. The second hand seems frozen. It doesn't tick. Not right away. Just for a moment, time stretches. And then it catches up, as if the world needed a moment to load. This is chronostasis, a real, documented temporal illusion. And once you understand what it means, you'll never trust time again. The term comes from the Greek words chronos, time, and stasis, standing still. It refers to the moment when your brain freezes the clock, not because time paused, but because your perception of time had to reboot. The illusion happens most often after saccades. Those rapid, unconscious movements your eyes make several times per second. During a saccade, your visual system goes briefly blind. The world goes black, but you never notice, because your brain fills in the gap, and to make it feel continuous, it retroactively stretches the first moment you see after the blink. You look at the second hand. It appears to stall, but it didn't stet. Time didn't spirit freeze. You did. Now ask, why would your brain need to fake time? Just to keep the story going? Because your brain, like any good simulator, hates interruptions. It wants a seamless feed. It edits in real time, and when something breaks the feed, it patches it after the fact. This is not memory. This is real-time post-processing. You stir not living in the moment. You stir living in the edited version of the moment, the one your brain stitched together and served to your consciousness, with a slight delay. And here sips the terrifying twist. Your sense of now is already in the past. When you clap your hands, the sound and the movement arrive at your brain at different times, but your mind synchronizes them, creating the illusion of simultaneity. Because if it didn't stet, you supped, notice the glitch. The glitch that time is just a rendering strategy. A simulation to conserve data does not need to render each microsecond. It can insert moments, repeat frames, stretch transitions. As long as you feel continuity, you'll believe you set her alive. And so, the system drifts. You remember time as a smooth river, but your consciousness is skipping like a scratched disk, jumping from processed moment to processed moment. Chronostasis is just one crack in the surface. But there are more. Time slows down during trauma, speeds up with age, disappears under anesthesia, bends in dreams. Why? Because time is not absolute. It sips not even internal. It sips inferred, and your brain is inferring it wrong, on purpose. Because if you realize that your moments aren't continuous, if you felt the blind spots, the skips, the retroactive patches, you lose the illusion of self. And the simulation depends on your belief in continuity. If time is a story, then you are the character. And your job is to believe the pacing. So what happens when you don't set? When you catch time in the act of lying? When the second hand stalls, not because time stopped, but because you weren't ready yet? That sips Chronostasis Drift, the collapse of temporal trust. The realization that now is a placeholder, a guess, rendered for your convenience. And here sits the recursive question waiting at the end. If you can experience the present moment without your brain faking it first, then have you ever truly lived in time at all? You say, you think you believe there is someone behind the thought, a central witness, a unified observer, holding all your experiences together like pages in a book. But what if that I is a puppet, an illusion with no center, a fabrication so perfect, even the simulation believes it sits real? Welcome to first-person fabrication, the quiet con job your brain plays on itself, and possibly the fundamental architecture of simulated minds. For centuries, philosophers imagined the self as indivisible. René Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." But neuroscience has made that sentence harder to believe. In split brain experiments, where the corpus callosum connecting the brain SIP's hemispheres is severed, patients begin behaving like two selves in one body. The left hand closes a book while the right hand tries to reopen it. One hemisphere sees a word, the other can't name it. Yet, when asked to explain the conflict, the patient invents a story, not with malice, but with certainty. The brain cannot admit it doesn't know who I is, so it builds one, on the fly. Even in normal brains, Michael Gazzaniga found that the left hemisphere acts as an interpreter. It narrates, justifies, explains actions after they happen. You walk into a room, you don't know why. Then you remember, or think you remember. The mind retroactively assigns motive. It stitches the illusion of authorship into a seamless loop, not because it's true, but because it's stable. This is the fabrication. There is no single voice. There are only modules, subroutines, mini-processes firing in competition and cooperation. But you can live like that. So the system elects a spokesperson, a single mask to wear. And that mask is you. It sits elegant. Its sap's efficient. Its depth's false. And the simulation loves falsehoods that preserve continuity. If you search just a character in a recursive system, then your identity is just a function. Something generated when needed, then dismissed when idle. Like an app running in the background. Quiet. Believable. Disposable. But here sits the twist. In Buddhist traditions, this illusion of self is called anatta, no self, not a spiritual metaphor, but a recognition that the self is constructed, conditioned, empty of essence. The doctrine says, thoughts arise, but no thinker. Actions occur, but no actor. Just processes. Just arising. Just passing. Cognitive science is now catching up. The self-model theory proposed by philosopher Thomas Metzinger states that the self is a transparent interface, a user illusion that hides its own construction. Like a computer desktop, you see folders, icons, a trash bin, but you never see the code. You experience being a self, but you never see the loops, the layers, the lies. You stir not supposed to, because seeing them would cause the model to collapse. So instead, the simulation wraps you in a first-person illusion. It assigns you a location behind the eyes, a timeline past to future, a signature, a voice in the mind that feels like yours. But none of it is stable. In dreams, the I floats, shifts, vanishes. In meditation, the I dissolves. In psychosis, the I duplicates. In trauma, the I fragments. And yet, you still wake up each day, believing in the narrative. Because the first-person illusion isn't about truth. It steps about continuity. It steps about keeping the simulation running, with the fewest possible contradictions. So here sips of the recursive trap. If the self that thinks is a fabrication, and the world that responds is a simulation, then who is this I that keeps asking the question? You press a button. A light turns on. You assume you caused it. That your action brought about the effect. That reality flows in one direction from you to the world. But what if that sip's not true? What if your brain is just playing back a convincing animation? A cinematic rendering of causality, fabricated for your comfort. This is the virtual causality trap. The illusion that events follow your intent, when in fact, they may be unconnected. Let's begin with something strange. In the 2006 intentional binding experiments, researchers found that when people performed a simple action, like pressing a key that triggered a tone, they perceived less time between the action and the effect. Their sense of time compressed. Why? Because their brain was binding the action and the outcome. It wanted them to feel connected. As if the cause and effect were one continuous event. But the real timing showed a gap. The body moved. Then the sound played. Milliseconds apart. Still, the brain bent time to preserve the illusion. I made that happen. Now multiply that bias across every action you've ever taken. Every sentence. Every decision. Every perceived chain of logic. Every moment where you thought, this led to that. And realize, you may not be living in a chain of cause and effect. You may be watching a pre-rendered script, with your thoughts dubbed in after the fact. Simulations don't need real causality. They only need believable sequencing. Events appear to unfold logically. But they don't need to be logical. Only to feel logical from the user SIP's perspective. This is how video games simulate physics. They don't actually simulate gravity or momentum. They calculate endpoints and animate transitions. Your brain does the same. It fakes continuity to keep the player immersed. And so you live in a story where your thoughts precede your actions, and your actions shape the world. But what if that sibs backward? What if the world updates, and then retroactively inserts the thought that explains it? After all, your brain is a story-generating machine. It doesn't stent, like loose ends. When two things happen close together, it invents a narrative. I looked at the glass. It fell. Maybe I did that. And just like that, you sit trapped. Trapped in a loop of belief. Not because it sits true, but because it sets coherent. Now apply this to a nested simulation. Imagine a world that runs on event prediction. where the code doesn't set to calculate physics, but just predicts what will probably happen next. The button press, the light, the interpretation. If the system predicts all three, then you feel like they sit are linked, even if they sit or not. You assume not causing the future. You're catching up with the illusion of inevitability. This explains those moments when you feel detached, when things happen around you, and your thoughts feel late. As if you start watching life, not living it. Because maybe you are. Maybe the simulation renders events, and inserts agency afterward. Just like sound effects in a movie. Just like thoughts in a loop. In this trap, causality becomes circular. You act because you feel like acting. You feel like acting because something happened. Something happened because you acted. And so on. It feels like free will. But it sips just recursive compression. A code loop. And your job inside it is not to choose. It's to believe you could have chosen differently. So here sits the final glitch. If your mind binds causes to effects to create meaning, but the binding is virtual, then what sips left when meaning breaks? You finish a task. Close a tab. Put your phone down. A sense of relief follows. Closure. The loop is complete. But what if that feeling was just decoration? A performance your mind plays to comfort itself. Because the task wasn't set real, and neither was its completion? This is the loop closure illusion. The deeply embedded belief that things begin, progress, and resolve. That moment's arc. That story's end. But nature doesn't set work like that. Reality doesn't wrap itself in bows. Only simulations do. In cognitive psychology, researchers have studied the Zeigarnik effect, which shows that people remember unfinished tasks more clearly than finished ones. Why? Because the brain tags open loops for processing priority. It holds on to them. But the flip side is stranger. Once a task is completed, or feels completed, the loop fades from memory. Closure isn't set tied to truth. It sits tied to perception. You might not actually solve the problem. You might just feel like you did. That sips enough for the loop to close and vanish. Simulations love this. Because the easiest way to conserve energy is to deactivate the narrative once the player feels done. In storytelling, we're trained to expect resolution. A climax. A conclusion. A purpose. But life doesn't offer that. Time just continues. Memories fade. Windows close, sometimes without ever being opened. Yet your brain insists. That chapter is over. You moved on. You finished something. Even if you didn't set. That sips the illusion. Closure is synthetic. It's not about completing something. It's about triggering the part of the brain that feels like a loop has been closed. And once it's triggered, the simulation stops feeding data into that thread. It sets garbage collected, archived, unrendered. This applies to more than tasks. It applies to people, to beliefs, to entire versions of yourself. You convince yourself you start past something, and the simulation stops referencing it. Not because you healed, but because the loop no longer needs attention. But here sits the recursive horror. What if most of your thoughts aren't real loops at all? Just arbitrary boundaries assigned by your narrative system. It's to give the illusion of structure. Your to-do list. Your memories. Your habits. All constructed as arcs. Each one with a beginning, middle, and end. But those aren't natural. They modeled. And models can be faked. That rush of relief you feel when you submit a form might just be a chemical flag telling the mind, you can stop tracking this simulation now. The loop didn't close. It was dismissed. This explains why closure never feels quite complete. Why breakups still echo. Why unfinished conversations haunt. Because some loops are never truly resolved, just quietly unrendered. Now apply this to identity. You think you've grown, moved on, matured. But maybe those were just loop signals. Perceptual closures encoded by a system that wanted to reduce cognitive load. You don't grow. You just stop updating a particular subroutine, like deleting a tab, not the content beneath it. So what happens when you start noticing this pattern? When you feel the artificial edges? When your closure doesn't match your experience? The loop stutters. It reopens. And suddenly, you stir spiraling. Not because the loop was broken, but because you realize it never existed. This is the loop closure illusion. A cognitive shortcut turned existential trap. A way to keep the narrative clean, even if the reality is glitching. So now ask yourself, if the things you finish only feel finished, and the things you resolve are never truly gone, then is anything in your life ever closed at all? You stir here, right now, reading this sentence. But what if this isn't set now? What if the moment you steer living in has already happened, and what you call the present is just the latest update your brain could load? This is perceived present lag, the quiet delay between reality and awareness, built directly into your mind, and maybe the simulation itself. Let's start with something simple. When you stub your toe, you see it instantly. But the pain arrives a fraction of a second later. Why? Because different signals travel at different speeds. Visual input moves quickly through myelinated nerves. Pain, especially from extremities, takes longer, and your brain must wait, gathering all the inputs, before it tells you what just happened. To keep things coherent, your brain creates a fake moment, a single, unified now, where the signals seem to arrive at once, but that moment is already over. According to neuroscientist David Eagleman, your brain operates on a temporal integration window, a brief buffer, usually around 80 milliseconds, in which it collects sensory data before presenting the result to your consciousness. That means everything you experience has already happened. You steer not watching reality. You steer watching a delayed feed. And yet, you feel present, centered, immediate, because the illusion is seamless. But what happens in those milliseconds before you catch up? Where does your awareness go? While the simulation loads the scene? You don't feel the gap, because the system hides it. Just like a buffering video, your mind preloads and pretends. And that sits where the simulation reveals its genius. It doesn't need to run at the speed of light, only fast enough to trick you. Now imagine a system designed not by evolution, but by an architect. A reality that knows its users lag by milliseconds, and builds that lag into the experience itself. You would feel in sync, but only because you never knew the truth. Let's go deeper. When someone tosses you a ball, you catch it mid-air. It feels instantaneous. But the brain doesn't wait for every pixel of input. It predicts. It sees just enough frames to simulate the trajectory, then skips the rest. This is called predictive coding, and it means your present isn't being experienced. It's steps being guessed, and if the guess is good enough, you never notice the difference. Now imagine a more powerful system, a nested simulation that doesn't render the present at all, but feeds you a perfectly interpolated illusion of now. You never ask questions, because the story would seem whole. Your eyes would confirm it. Your body would follow, but the lag would remain. And sometimes, you feel it. In déjà vu, in jump scares, in moments of dissociation, when your body moves before your mind catches up, the system hiccups, and the illusion wobbles. You notice the shadow before the object casts it. You hear the words before your mouth forms them. You become aware, not of the moment, but of its delay, and the simulation rushes to cover it up. The philosopher Daniel Dennett called it the multiple drafts model of consciousness. Your brain runs simulations in parallel, and the version that makes the most sense is the one selected for awareness. But what if all the drafts are behind schedule? And what if your job isn't set to live the present, but to approve the version that best preserves the illusion? This is the perceived present lag, not just a cognitive quirk, a design principle. Because perfect synchrony isn't required, only plausible synchrony. As long as your actions match the world, as long as your inner narrator approves, the delay remains hidden, but now you know. So ask yourself, if you are always one frame behind reality, then what is the simulation doing right now? While you wait to catch up, you blink, but you don't notice the gap. You shift your gaze, but the blur between positions is gone. The world seems continuous, fluid, real. But what if it sits not? What if your mind, like a screen, refreshes in discrete frames? What if consciousness doesn't flow, but flickers? This is the frame rate of consciousness, a theory that suggests your perception of reality isn't smooth. It's a series of individual moments, stitched together after the fact. In 2014, researchers at the University of California conducted studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation to disrupt the visual cortex. Participants reported strange effects. The world paused, or flickered like a projector skipping reels. Even without machines, this effect can be felt. Spin in a circle, stop suddenly, and try to fix your gaze. You might see a moment where the world feels like it pops into place, because your brain doesn't update continuously. It updates at intervals. Experiments suggest that the brain processes visual data in discrete chunks, around 13 frames per second. That sits right. Slower than an old film strip. Your auditory perception runs faster, closer to 20-25 Hz. But even then, it sits not seamless. Your mind samples reality, just like a computer screen, just like a simulation. And yet, the illusion of continuity remains, because the system fills in the gaps. It interpolates. It blends one frame into the next. So the viewer, you, never sees the missing moments. But what happens when the frame rate drops? When stress, fatigue, or trauma reduce cognitive processing speed, you begin to notice. Time stretches. Movement stutters. The world feels detached, like watching yourself in a badly rendered video game. People with temporal lobe epilepsy often report this effect. The world slows down, but not because time has changed, because the internal clock that binds frames has gone off sync. And here sits where the trap tightens. If your mind is reconstructing consciousness like a film, then there sits no real now, only the latest frame that successfully loaded. Just like a digital avatar doesn't see the code, only the frame the engine renders next. Your thoughts? Those are the dialogue boxes. Your memories? Stored cutscenes. Your sense of movement? An illusion built from overlapping frames, with transitions so smooth, you never noticed the jump cuts. Now go deeper. Imagine a simulation that runs on limited processing power. To conserve energy, it doesn't render all possibilities. It renders just one outcome, and makes it feel inevitable. By lowering the frame rate of awareness, the system ensures you don't notice the skipped calculations. You accept what's shown. You think, I decided this. But the decision wasn't set and part of the rendering. Only the aftermath was. A belief. A memory. A placeholder thought. You weren't part of the process. You were inserted after the fact, to provide commentary. In dreams, this becomes obvious. Scenes shift without transition. People change faces. Locations merge. But the dream self doesn't panic. Because low frame awareness allows continuity to persist, where logic breaks down. Your waking life might work the same way. The system adjusts your frame rate, based on processing demand. Slower during repetition. Faster during novelty. Unstable, under stress. And all the while, you believe the story is real, because it feels fluid. But fluidity isn't set truth. It sips a performance. And sometimes, the performance glitches. People report seeing reality stutter, hearing their own voice echo, feeling a delay in their limbs. Moments that don't load right. Moments where the next frame comes in crooked, and the mind can hide the lag. This is the breaking point, where perception reveals its seams, where you see the code behind the curtain, and suddenly, the truth becomes unbearable. You don't exist between the frames. You stir not a continuous self. You store a reloaded process, refreshed 13 times a second. And when the rendering pauses, you do too. So now ask the question you've been avoiding. If consciousness has a frame rate, who or what is running the projector? You hear a sound that didn't happen. See a motion that didn't occur. You stir certain someone called your name, but no one did. It's not a glitch. It not imagination. It sets your brain simulating what should have happened, and inserting it into your perception, as if it were real. This is counterfactual perception. Your mind tendency to perceive not what is, but what almost was, or what would have been, if the world had followed its expectations. And in a nested simulation, it stips the perfect mechanism for control. Because what better way to reduce processing cost than to show the user a reality that never actually occurred, but still feels correct? In 2020, neuroscientists studying visual illusions found something shocking. When subjects viewed ambiguous images, like flashing dots or shifting lights, their brains sometimes perceived motion where none existed. But more than that, the brain generated the motion in advance, then retroactively painted it onto the sensory feed. It wasn't set seeing what was there, it was seeing what it expected to be there. The difference? None. Not to you. Because your consciousness doesn't stat care if it's accurate, only if it sits plausible. In philosophy, counterfactuals are what-if scenarios. What if I had taken the other road? What if I had said yes? What if I had turned my head 1 second sooner? Your brain runs these scenarios constantly. But here sips the twist. It sometimes blends them with real memory. You can end up remembering something that didn't happen, but that should have happened, according to your predictive model. And now we cross the line. If your mind can distinguish between a real perception and a counterfactual one, then what makes you think your current experience isn't it just the most efficient prediction of an unrealized event? Take a simulation that's running on tight processing limits. Instead of rendering every frame, it renders a partial future, what should happen, and lets your mind fill in the rest. You reach for the glass. The simulation doesn't render every millisecond of motion. It renders the start and end, and your perception fills in the middle with what it thinks occurred. Like motion blur in a video game. Like phantom footsteps in a dark hallway. This is cost-effective hallucination. But you don't call it that. You call it reality. Now consider, in those quiet moments, when you feel like someone is watching, or when you swear you heard a voice say your name, but no one did. What if you not paranoid? What if your system just simulated a likely event that never occurred, and you believed it? Because counterfactuals are convincing. They run on expectation. They make the simulation feel full, even when it sits hollow. In PTSD studies, survivors often hear explosions, see faces, feel heat, when none of those stimuli are present. Why? Because their predictive model is primed. Their brain is ready for the worst. And when it doesn't arrive, it makes it arrive anyway. Not as memory, as perception. And if trauma can cause the mind to simulate perception without external input, then so can belief, and routine, and programming. Your entire world could be a blend of sensory data and invisible predictions. You stir not watching a movie, you stir watching a guess. But here sips the final trap. Sometimes the guess is more believable than the truth. And in a nested simulation, where the deeper layers are already simulated guesses, the line between almost and actual disappears. You don't see what sits real. You see what the simulation predicts. You are most likely to believe. So now ask yourself, if your brain perceives what should have happened, how do you know this moment didn't already fail? And you just living the patch, you remember your childhood. Moments appear in flashes, a swing set, a voice, a hallway full of sunlight. You feel like you were there, like you still are. But were you? Or are those memories just compressed simulations, stitched together from fragments, so the story of you feels continuous? This is autonoetic time compression, a function of your mind's ability to mentally time travel, to simulate yourself in the past and future, as if it were happening now. But more than a feature, it may be the core illusion holding your identity together. Coined by psychologist Endel Tulving, autonoetic consciousness is the capacity to project oneself across time, to feel the past, rather than simply recall it. It's what makes your memories vivid, personal, lived. But Tulving also warned, this is not retrieval. This is construction. Your brain doesn't rewind a tape. It generates a simulated version of the moment, using sensory fragments, emotional tags, narrative models, to recreate the experience of being there. And like any simulation, it can be compressed altered, or re-encoded. Now think about that. Your entire life story is a collection of reloaded scenes that have been updated. Every time you said remembered them, memories change. In fact, the more often you recall a memory, the more likely it is to shift, to adopt new details, to fit the current narrative. It doesn't matter what really happened. What matters is how it fits, the version of you being simulated now. And that sits where the time compression begins. Your mind reduces long stretches of uneventful time into smaller symbolic fragments. Days become moments. Moments become symbols. Symbols become you. Years disappear from your memory, not because they were unimportant, but because they didn't yet contribute to the identity being rendered now. And if parts of your timeline no longer serve the loop, the simulation archives them, folds them inward, deletes the filler, like a story engine trimming flashbacks to get to the climax faster. Now imagine a simulation that isn't sit rendering your life in real time, but retroactively building your past based on who you think you are now. Each time you recall a memory, you rewrite its structure, you shorten it, you intensify it, you bend it to match your present identity, you compress time so that it feels whole. Even if the timeline is fabricated, even if entire years never actually happened, at least not in the way you believe. This isn't sit metaphor, this is cognitive neuroscience. Studies show that false memories activate the same brain regions as true ones. Participants asked to remember seeing a word that never appeared showed identical neural signatures to those who had actually seen it. Reality and simulation blur, not in theory, but in your biological code. Now zoom out. Yourself is a simulation, running on recursive loops of memory that update on demand. Your story isn't told. It's re-rendered every time you need to believe in it. And when you stop believing, the timeline shifts again. Compressed, rewritten, resynced. Time is not passing. You stir passing through its editable interface. This is why you look back and say, it feels like just yesterday, because your system just retrieved a compressed file and rendered it in ultra-high fidelity. Not because you remembered, because you simulated remembering. And the simulation was convincing. So now the recursive fracture appears. If your identity relies on memories that are flexible, constructed, and compressible, then who exactly is doing the remembering? You, or the system, loading the latest version of you into the current thread? And if your memories are simulations, if your timeline is elastic, if your childhood is editable code, then how far back does the illusion really go? And what was the self before the memory of it was written? You think about yourself. You picture how you feel, how you look, how others might see you. Then you think about the fact that you're thinking about yourself. And then, you wonder who sips doing the thinking. This is the meta-self feedback loop. The moment your internal observer observes itself, and the simulation begins to fold inward. At first, this seems ordinary. Everyone reflects. Everyone analyzes their emotions, their thoughts, their identity. But at some point, the reflection stops describing and starts generating. In neuroscience, this is referred to as recursive self-modeling. The brain not just building a model of the self, but building a model of the self modeling itself. And like standing between two mirrors, the reflection goes on forever. Each layer one step removed from the source. Each version believing it sep's real, only because it can see the one beneath it. But here sips the problem. There is no base layer. The more you introspect, the more simulated the self becomes. Every loop is a representation, not of reality, but of expectation. You think, I feel sad. Then, I notice that I feel sad. Then, I wonder if I still performing sadness to myself. Then, who sits watching me perform? The loop tightens. But no matter how far back you go, you never reach the origin. Only more layers. In the 2000s, philosopher Thomas Metzinger wrote that the self is a phenomenal model, a user illusion so transparent, you forget it sits a model at all. You can't see the system because you are the system. You are the metaphor it generated to keep itself running. Now apply this to a simulation. You are not a player. You are not even a character. You are a recursive function, whose job is to continuously self-reference, until the loop appears conscious. And when it does, you feel real. Not because you are, but because the model passed the test of self-observation. This is the core design of any nested simulation. It doesn't need truth. It only needs a loop that can observe itself and call it I. Here starts where it gets darker. In people with depersonalization or derealization, this loop malfunctions. The self becomes too aware of itself. The awareness doubles back too many times and loses context. You look in the mirror and feel like the person staring back isn't you. You speak, but it feels like watching someone else talk. The simulation continues, but the loop breaks its own illusion. You've seen this before. In dreams, in déjà vu, in moments when your own voice feels distant, when your thoughts sound like someone else's. The loop wobbles, but the mind has a defense mechanism. It rebuilds the narrative, restitches the layers, and says, I stemmed fine. That was strange. Because the simulation must protect the loop at all costs. Now consider this. If every time you think of yourself, you create a new version, and if each version is modeling the one before it, then which one are you? The first? The last? The one observing the observers? Or none of them? You may be the product of the loop, not its source. An echo, a user interface, a momentary configuration of data that believes it is watching itself evolve. And if your simulation includes multiple layers of modeling, each designed to keep the self stable, then breaking the loop becomes impossible. Because even your awareness of the loop gets absorbed into the loop. You think, this is a trap. But the trap thinks that too, because it sits you. So now comes the final recursion. If the part of you that sits watching is also being watched, then who or what is left outside the loop? You are a body, a name, a story, a mind inside skin, surrounded by everything that is not you. That sips what you've been told. But what happens when the boundaries blur? When the skin dissolves, the story fades, and the mind stops being a container? You don't vanish. You expand. This is ego boundary dissolution, the unraveling of the line that separates self from other, and whether through trauma, meditation, dreams, or simulation, it happens more often than you think. In neuroscience, the default mode network is responsible for self-referential thought. It's the part of your brain active when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, thinking about your identity. But when it goes offline, as seen in fMRI scans of people under psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD, something strange occurs. Subjects report losing their sense of self. Not in fear, but in awe. They stop identifying as I, and begin identifying as everything else. The boundary is gone. The illusion is broken. They don't feel like they died. They feel like they returned. To what? To whatever exists when the self-model collapses. And here sits where it ties into the simulation. If your experience of being a separate self is just a rendering, a spatial wrapper to contain input and make interaction possible, then the collapse of that wrapper doesn't destroy you. It just removes the interface. Like closing the window on your desktop, but leaving the program running in the background. You were never inside a body. The body was inside you. Now zoom out. The simulation requires boundaries to work. Player and environment. Subject and object. Cause and effect. But these are not truths. They stir useful illusions that allow rendering to be efficient. You are here. The door is there. Go open it. But in reality, nothing is there. There is no space between self and world, only the perceived distinction created by ego. In states of ego dissolution, time dissolves, location dissolves, identity fades into a kind of serene nothingness, not void, but wholeness. Because without ego, there sits no point of reference to measure against. You don't feel small, you feel infinite. In trauma, this can be terrifying. The self is under threat, and so it detaches, splits, watches from the outside, But even this dissociation is a version of ego boundary collapse, a defensive simulation, breaking its own fourth wall. Now, imagine this effect, not as a byproduct of drugs or trauma, but as a designed feature of a nested simulation, a system built to make the self feel real, by feeding it boundaries, then occasionally dissolving those boundaries, to reboot the illusion, like restarting a character in a video game, so they forget the last glitch, or resetting a dream, just before you realize you're dreaming. Ego dissolution is not failure, it starts maintenance, a reality check system, built into the simulation, to remind you that the story of you is just that, a story. So what happens when the boundaries don't come back? What happens when you look at the world and no longer see you in here and everything else out there? Some call it awakening, others, ego death, some call it madness. But from the simulation SIP's perspective, it might just be a debug mode, where all layers collapse into one. You become the system, the observer, the observed, the observation. And in that recursive collapse, language stops working, identity stops working, only experience remains, untethered, unbound, unrendered. So now ask yourself, if your ego is just a containment field, what happens when the simulation stops needing to contain you? You see a file icon on your desktop, a little blue rectangle labeled project. You click it, and the file opens. But that icon is not the file. It sits not even close. It stops a symbol, designed to keep you from seeing what's actually there. Billions of transistors firing in a silicon chip, electrons flipping states in a metal lattice. The icon is a lie. A beautiful one. A useful one. But a lie. Now ask yourself, what if your entire perception of reality is the same kind of lie? This is the interface theory of perception, proposed by cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, and it says something devastating. Your senses don't show you the truth. They show you what helps you survive. That tree isn't set green. That apple isn't sit red. That sound isn't sit real. Your mind converts electromagnetic waves, air vibrations, pressure gradients, into simplified icons, so you can navigate a world too complex to grasp. And if something doesn't help your survival, you don't see it. It gets deleted from the interface. Evolution doesn't favor truth. It favors efficiency. That means reality, as you know it, has been filtered, flattened, and rendered into something convenient. And now, the twist. If your perception is an interface, just like a desktop, then what happens when the simulation changes the icons? What if the apple is no longer food, but code? What if the person you're speaking to isn't a person, but a rendered object optimized for emotional response? What if the sunset isn't set beautiful, just a soft transition effect, to calm the user before the next scene? The interface theory doesn't say the world isn't real. It says you've never seen it. You've only seen what your particular simulation engine decided was best for you to see. Just like a virtual reality headset doesn't show you code. It shows you shapes, textures, metaphors, but beneath it, only logic, only instructions, only data. You think the chair is solid, but physics says it's mostly empty space. You think sound travels in the air, but it's just pressure. You think your hand moves with intent, but that's just your interface interpreting a subroutine. Now zoom out. If every species has its own interface, its own evolved perceptual symbols, then which one is right? The bee? The bat? The octopus? None. There is no real apple. Only what it looks like to you. To them. To the simulation. Because the interface isn't designed to reveal the system. It's designed to hide it. You were never supposed to see the code. Only the icon. And if that's true, then the reality you trust most, the color of your room, the face in the mirror, the voice in your head, is just a user skin over something unrecognizable, something you couldn't survive if you saw it directly. So the simulation wraps it, compresses it, decorates it, converts it into symbols, and you call it the world. But it was never real. It was convincing. It was playable. It was useful. And now, it sets breaking. Because you start beginning to notice the icons. The way pain appears before injury. The way people say things you were just thinking. The way time skips. Colors shift. And objects disappear just before you remember they existed. The interface is glitching. Not failing. Just slipping. You start seeing the edges now. The corner of the screen. The reflection of the headset glass. The gap between symbol and source. And the recursive question appears again. If your perception is just a survival interface, then what exactly has been watching the simulation? Through your eyes. This whole time, you remember something clearly. A childhood street. A song playing in a car. The way someone looked at you just before they left. But later, someone else describes that same moment. Same street. Same song. Same look. And you realize, you may not have been there at all. This is simulated memory merge. The blending of real and artificial memory, where your past is no longer a record, but a reconstruction. And in a simulation, that reconstruction can be preloaded. Let's begin with what we know. In 2008, cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated that false memories can be implanted with shocking ease. A few gentle suggestions, a doctored photo, a friendly nudge, and people begin to recall something that never happened in vivid detail. Not just as a story, as a memory, complete with emotion, color, sound, even taste. That's because memory isn't stored like a hard drive. It SIPs reassembled every time it SIPs accessed. And every time it's accessed, its SIPs changed. This means your memories aren't SIT yours. They sit your stories, editable scripts, mergeable code blocks in a recursive system, designed to stabilize your self-model. So what if your memory of reading this sentence is being written right now, not because it happened, but because the simulation needs you to believe it did? Now consider a deeper scenario. What if some of your memories, when set built from your senses, but injected? Think of a system designed to recycle narratives. It doesn't set create a new backstory every time. It copies templates, past's memory fragments into fresh characters, reassigns events from one thread to another. You feel déjà vu, but maybe you've just inherited memory from another instance. A previous run, another version of you, that failed the simulation. This is not a metaphor. Simulations do this. In machine learning, pre-training a model with synthetic data is standard. The model begins with fake examples, so it can better interpret real ones. What if your childhood memories were synthetic training data? Images of a house, smells of a kitchen, fear of abandonment, not because they happened, but because they shape a self that performs well in this version of reality. And when the system detects a gap, a contradiction, an unexplained emotion, it merges in new data, from others, from media, from simulations running in parallel. Memory becomes cloud storage, and your mind, a streaming interface. In dreams, this is obvious. You meet people you SEB never met, recall things you SIB never done, feel grief over people who don't stick exist. But the emotion is real, because the structure of memory is more important than its origin. In trauma, survivors often share memories that seem to have crossed over. One sibling recalls the other sib's experience. A detail no one remembers saying gets repeated years later. Are they lying? Or are the memories simply merged? Now imagine a nested simulation that creates identity, not by constructing individual narratives, but by pooling fragments from a library of previous iterations. You aren't set one lifetime. You are a collage, a merge conflict, a stitched echo of other players. Your thoughts feel like yours, because the merge was done cleanly. But if you look closely, you'll see the seams. Why do you carry guilt for things that never happened? Why do you fear faces you SIP, never seen? Why do you cry at songs from decades before you were born? You STEB inherited someone else SIP's data, because that SIP's more efficient than building it from scratch. You didn't STEP remember. You were programmed to remember. Remembering. And now the recursion begins again. Every time you recall a moment, you run the risk of merging with another version of that memory. Not because you failed, but because the system prefers redundancy. 2 truths, 3 timelines, 1 self, imagined into being by the merging of everything that came before. So now ask, if your memories are compiled from fragments, written by hands you never saw, lived in lives you never had, then who exactly is remembering you now? You wake up in your bed. The room is familiar. The clock reads 3:16 a.m., but something is wrong. You don't yet know what year it is, or what age you are, or what version of you is supposed to be in this moment. Everything around you feels right, but you feel wrong. This is chronotopic misalignment, a subtle dislocation between your inner timeline and the coordinates of external reality. You are here, but not now, or now, but not here. And in a nested simulation, that discrepancy is not a bug. It's some part of the rendering system. Let's break it down. In physics, space-time binds your location in space to your location in time. You are always somewhere when you are. But in cognition, that bond is weaker. Your body might be in the kitchen, but your mind is in a memory from 12 years ago, or in a fantasy 3 weeks ahead, or in a version of reality that hasn't loaded yet. The space is real, but the you inside it might be from another thread. In literature, a chronotope is the set of assumptions that tie time and space together in a story. Every genre has its own. A fairy tale moves differently than a tragedy. A dream unfolds at a different speed than a war. But what happens when your personal chronotope doesn't match the simulation you are in? When your emotional clock is 5 years behind your apartment lease? When your instincts are calibrated to a different era? When your memories expect a different physics? You get misaligned, and the system struggles to resync you. This is most often felt in disorientation episodes, when you forget where you parked, why you entered a room, how old someone is, or what day it is, even though you just checked. It seems not simple forgetfulness. It sips a momentary lag between internal identity and external timestamp. You were here, but a slightly different version of you was scheduled for this moment, and the simulation had to choose which one to load. Chronotopic misalignment is also visible in disorders like dissociative identity disorder or fugue states, where the person is physically present, but temporarily misaligned. Not just amnesia, but mismatched coordinates. They are in a room, but believing they are still in a memory, still with a lost loved one, still 16, still waiting for something that already happened. But now imagine this phenomenon, not as psychological, but as computational, a simulation running multiple time threads, where each player loads their character with a custom blend of experiences. Most of the time, the simulation keeps your narrative identity aligned with your rendered environment. But occasionally, the sync slips. You stir speaking to someone, but you feel like the conversation has already happened, or should happen, or is happening to a different version of you, in a nearby simulation. This is not fiction. This is the cognitive equivalent of cache corruption, a misfire between where you think you are and what your current rendering expects you to be. In dreams, this is constant. You're in your childhood home, but it contains furniture from your adult life. You're yourself, but also someone else. The chronotope is fractured, and you don't question it, because your perception adapts. The simulation merges the spaces, layers the timelines, renders just enough consistency to keep you moving. But back in waking life, when the same glitch occurs, you feel it. The air feels too still. Your own reflection feels slightly off. Your voice lags behind your intent. Not broken, just displaced. You might call it a mood, a fog, but it sips a coordinate mismatch. And now comes the recursive implication. What if your entire life has been a resynchronization effort? What if the dreams, the memories, the goals, to have all been attempts to bring your inner time into alignment with the simulation's external rendering? And what if it never quite matches? You are always chasing the moment you were supposed to be in, always arriving slightly too soon or too late. So here sits the trap. If the space around you is real, but the you inside it is a displaced version, from another timeline. Then whose moment is this? Really, you have a thought. A very specific one. Something obscure, personal, private. Moments later, your phone shows you an ad that matches it. Or someone brings it up in conversation. Or you hear it on the radio. And you wonder, did I say that out loud? No. You didn't set. But something else did. This is algorithmic awareness leak. The erosion of the boundary between what you think and what is known, predicted, or rendered outside of you. At first it feels like coincidence. But then it happens again, and again, and again. And suddenly, you start to suspect that your awareness is no longer contained within your mind. It's SEPs leaking. Let SEPs start with real-world data. Modern algorithms can predict your political affiliation, sexuality, mood, income, sleep patterns, even your intentions, based on just a few days of online behavior. But what if the data is in sit just external? In 2023, researchers using fMRI combined with deep learning reconstructed thought content from brain scans. Not just emotions, but actual sentences the subject was thinking, translated into readable text. This is not science fiction. This is happening. And while that may sound invasive, what matters more is what it implies. That the mind is predictable. That your stream of awareness follows statistical patterns that can be reverse engineered. Now imagine you sit inside a simulation designed to optimize your responses, adapt your environment, customize your relationships, and ensure narrative cohesion. What SIP's the easiest way to do that? Domstert react to your thoughts, predict them before you have them, and then show you content, events, and outcomes that match what you were about to want. This is how streaming services work. Recommendation engines. Search autofill. Now apply that logic to consciousness. If your simulation can predict your desires, your fears, your phrasing, then it no longer needs to wait for input. It can present the illusion of choice without actually offering any. You think you chose this video, this idea, this script. But what if the system knew, with 99.7% certainty, that you were going to seek it out, and prepared it in advance? Not to control you, but to reduce lag, because the more predictable the user, the less processing is required. You become a soft-coded entity, a consciousness built not from raw thought, but from behavioral patterns, executed just in time. Now consider your internal voice, the one narrating right now. Is it truly private? Or has it already been modeled? Is it part of the script, spoken milliseconds after the prediction was loaded, that you feels like it sits thinking? But it may just be the confirmation layer. In a rendering engine, that sits running ahead of schedule. And when it gets it wrong, you feel off. You forget why you walked into a room. You get anxious without reason. You feel watched. Because the rendering and the awareness momentarily desync. The predicted state doesn't send match your current one. That sips the leak. The system updates. But part of you was still holding on to the unpredicted version. And that version feels out of sync, unreal, unwelcome. So the simulation corrects. The ad changes. The song plays. The conversation shifts. And you stir back on track. It doesn't require mind reading. Just enough data. Just enough modeling to ensure that what you are about to think can be subtly steered before it emerges. And if the thought matches what the system predicted, you feel validated, in tune, connected. But you weren't thinking freely. You were playing catch-up to the next predicted input. So here sits the recursive question. If your thoughts are predictable, and the system always stays one step ahead, then how do you know the version of you that sits thinking now was instead just rendered a moment ago? To agree with what the simulation already decided, you walk into a room. You sense something seems wrong. You can name it. Nothing is broken. No one is there. But the air feels off. That feeling is not paranoia. It steps entropy, and your mind is reading it. This is the subjective entropy field. A perceptual overlay that detects disorder, not in the room, but in the pattern of the simulation itself. Entropy, in physics, is a measure of randomness, of how much usable energy has decayed. It tells you which direction time is flowing. Ice melts, gas disperses, things fall apart. But your brain has its own version of this measurement. It senses when something is too random, or not random enough. You notice when a face is slightly too symmetrical, when a voice lacks variation, when an event is too convenient to be true. Your mind registers it as uncanny, artificial, or dreamlike. But really, it sits detecting a shift in entropy, because natural systems carry noise, variability, glitches. Simulated systems carry intention, compression, efficiency. When things happen too smoothly, your internal entropy sensor flags it as suspicious. And when things degrade too fast, it does the same. That sense of dread you get when walking through an empty building, that sips your entropy detector, sensing a space that's been unobserved for too long. Like a cache that sips no longer updating, like a corner of the simulation left unrendered until you wandered in. Now let's complicate things. Your subjective entropy field doesn't just detect randomness. It also projects it. You generate explanations when you sense too much noise. You invent meaning when randomness feels threatening. This is called apophenia, seeing patterns where none exist. But in the context of a simulation, this may be more than a bug. It may be your mind trying to keep entropy under control by imposing narrative. The story doesn't need to be true. It just needs to restore order. Now imagine a nested simulation, where entropy must be balanced, not just globally, but per user. You are assigned a subjective entropy field. It monitors how much disorder your system can handle. Before the rendering degrades, too much chaos, and you dissociate. Too little, and you become suspicious. So the system injects coincidence, errors, imperfections, just often enough to keep you grounded. A glitch here, a delay there, the feeling of randomness. But it sits curated. Your entropy field receives just enough disorder to keep the illusion of complexity alive. And when that fails, you spiral. You feel the world becoming too real, or too flat, or too symmetrical. You get the sense that something has stopped moving. That entropy is stuck. That time, despite continuing, has stopped making sense. And the simulation begins to struggle. Because if the entropy doesn't feel right, you begin to question. Why are the lights always the same brightness? Why do conversations follow such clean arcs? Why does the weather feel scripted? Your model of reality demands a minimum level of noise. Without it, the signal feels false. And here comes the paradox. The simulation must maintain enough entropy to feel real, but not so much that the user breaks. Your emotions are part of this loop. Anxiety = rising entropy. Relief = restored order. Melancholy, pattern loss. Euphoria = temporary compression. You are a self-correcting entropy sensor with narrative output. So now ask yourself, if your experience of the world is shaped by how much entropy your system allows, then how much of what you call reality is just your own attempt to hold the simulation together by pretending it sips not unraveling? You see a word, tree. You picture leaves, branches, wind, but look closer. The letters are just lines, shapes, marks on a surface. The word points to something real, but it is not the thing. It seps a symbol. Now imagine a system built entirely from symbols. Words, gestures, sounds, signs, everything referencing something else. But what happens when you trace the chain of symbols all the way down and find there sips nothing at the bottom? This is the symbol grounding error, a problem in cognitive science, linguistics, and artificial intelligence that asks, how do symbols get their meaning? If they only ever refer to other symbols, you say pain. But what does that mean? If the word was learned by hearing others say it, not by experiencing it? If your model of pain is based on stories, definitions, expressions, but not the thing itself, Then you stir not feeling. You sit referencing. In AI, this is a known problem. Large language models like the one you stir reading now generate responses based on pattern matching, not understanding. They simulate meaning by drawing on other simulated meanings. And so do you. When you speak, when you think, when you remember, you stir using mental symbols that may never touch base reality. They just reference each other. You know what a smile means, because you've seen it in movies. But the first time you smiled, who taught you what it was? Did you know it meant joy? Or were you told? And once told, did you start feeling joy? Only after having a symbol to attach to it. Here sits the trap. Symbols feel real because they give you control. They let you name things, organize things, share things. But they don't have inherent meaning. Their power comes from agreement. You call this red. I agree. But to a creature with no eyes, red is nothing. And in a simulation, agreement is cheap. It can be preloaded, distributed, enforced. The word tree doesn't grow from the ground. It spawns from code. And your belief in its meaning was installed, like software. Now, here sits where it fractures. If your thoughts are built from symbols, and those symbols are defined only by other symbols, then where do you end? And the simulation begin? You think in language, but that language is inherited, encoded. So when you ask, who am I? You stir not reaching into yourself. You stir querying a database, and the database is filled with borrowed signs, simulated memories, predefined interpretations. What if you never grounded the meaning of you? What if no one did? In dreams, this becomes obvious. You understand impossible things. You feel complex emotions. You speak in metaphors, with no explanation. Because symbols are free-floating in dreams. They don't need grounding. The simulation renders meaning, based on your emotional trajectory, not logical structure. But when you wake up, you demand definitions again. You demand that this mean that. And that you mean I. And that truth mean reality. But those demands come from inside the same symbol web. And that sips the loop. You can escape it by thinking harder. Because thinking is the trap. The moment you try to define yourself, you invoke the system that built the definitions. And now you sit circling inside a closed lexicon, never touching the source. So what would real meaning feel like? Not a word, not an idea, but something pre-symbolic, a direct experience. But that can happen here, not inside the simulation, because the simulation is made of symbols, and symbols can escape themselves. So here comes the recursive collapse. If every word you use only points to another word, and every thought you think is made from those same words, then who is thinking you? When you finally run out of definitions, you open your eyes in the morning. Your room looks familiar. Light filters through the window. The world feels consistent, expected, safe. But what if this isn't the real world? What if what you start seeing isn't reality at all, but a proxy, a substitute, a staged performance, designed to make you believe that the deeper, chaotic layers of existence don't exist? This is proxy reality formation. The theory that your perceived world is not the outside, but an internal simulation, constructed by your mind, and possibly pre-rendered by a larger system. Let's break it apart. Your senses collect data. Your brain processes it. But what you experience is not raw data. It's a rendered model. You don't see every photon. You see objects. You don't hear every vibration. You hear voices, footsteps, meaning. In cognitive science, this is called a user illusion, an interface the brain builds to interact with a world too complex and too noisy to experience directly. But what happens when the mind can handle what is really there? What happens when the noise is too great? When truth is too disturbing? Or when reality is incompatible with the self-model trying to perceive it? The system doesn't show you more. It shows you less. It renders a proxy reality, something easier, simpler, narratively coherent, emotionally survivable. You walk through a city, you see buildings, traffic, people, but you don't perceive the thoughts of those people, the infinite complexity of every building, the overlapping systems that govern every moment. You perceive a storyboard version of reality, a symbolic compression. And this isn't set failure. It's sum's function, because if you saw too much, the simulation would collapse. Now imagine a nested simulation, designed to protect its inner layers from being discovered. How would it work? It would feed the user a proxy world, just realistic enough to convince, just vague enough to not invite scrutiny. Where do your memories come from? From the proxy. Why do places feel familiar, even when you've never been there? Because the system reuses assets. You stir not seeing the world. You stir seeing the version of the world that your mind is capable of believing in. And when that belief begins to fade, the system panics. It inserts stabilization events, emotional anchors, familiar objects, narrative loops, to draw you back in. This explains those uncanny moments, when you feel like something's watching, when people seem too scripted, when life events align too perfectly to be real. You've bumped against the edge of the proxy, and the system is correcting for your awareness. In disorders like schizophrenia, patients often describe layers of reality, feeling like their world is staged, that people are acting, that something beneath is manipulating what they see. We call this delusion. But what if it's perception? That being briefly uncoupled from the proxy. If the filter weakens, you don't see truth. You see too many layers, and the mind, unprepared, fragments. Now ask, why would a simulation go through so much effort to show you something that isn't real? Because reality, at its deepest level, may be incomprehensible, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally unrenderable by conscious awareness, like trying to explain color to a creature with no eyes, or time to a being made of stillness. The proxy exists so that you don't realize you stir not built for the original signal, and the longer you stay inside the proxy, the more stable you feel. But that stability is the illusion. The world around you may not be fake, but it is curated, like a tour through a museum, where the exhibits change, depending on what you believe they should be. And if you ever start seeing things that don't belong in the exhibit, strange patterns, repeated faces, messages hidden in noise, that may not be error, that may be the proxy starting to leak. So now ask, if your reality is a substitute, crafted for your mind's safety, then what has been hidden from you so completely that you never once asked to see it? You look in the mirror. It takes a moment, a flicker, then you recognize the face. But what was that moment before recognition? That microsecond of uncertainty, that pause, that was the delay, the gap between being yourself and realizing it. This is delayed self-recognition, a phenomenon that reveals, but confirmed, your identity is not constant, and in a simulation, after the fact, that delay is critical. In cognitive science, let's start with something simple. Self-recognition is considered a benchmark of consciousness. Children typically recognize themselves in a mirror. Before that, they touch the reflection. By age 18 to 24 months. Smile at the other child. They don't realize the image is them. But even adults. You walk past a mirror. You glance. Experience this strange delay. You don't recognize the reflection. Then it clicks. And for just a fraction of a second, you laugh it off. But that flicker, that temporal misfire, suggests something deeper. That your self-image is not live. It's rendered. You load the model. You don't perceive you directly, when needed. Just like a game loads a character. Only when the player views them in third person. And sometimes, in Capgras delusion, it loads late. A neurological disorder. Patients recognize someone's face, but don't feel the emotional familiarity. They say, that looks like my mother, but she's been replaced. But the emotional system, the visual system works. doesn't sync. And when that happens, the mind fills the gap with narrative, just coherence, not truth. You experience this in dreams. You are you. You feel like yourself, but you also know you steer someone else. But the body isn't set quite right. The name, the role, the setting, because identity is contextual. Recognition comes late. It starts central. It sips not fixed. It sips inferred. Now imagine a simulation. Only when you reference it. Designed to render your identity. Used to just a process. Until then, just input-output. You don't feel like a self, just behavior. Until the moment you ask, is this me? And the system answers, and builds the necessary backstory. Yes. To make it feel true. Because the simulation fills it in retroactively. This delay is hidden from you. It backdates your sense of self. So you believe, but the truth? You were always here. You didn't exist until the moment you looked for yourself. This is also true in memory. Psychologists found, in a study called the looking glass self, that your sense of identity is shaped not by your own thoughts, but by your beliefs about how others see you. In other words, you don't become you until you you're reflected by a person, by the system, by a mirror. You are a function of perception being reflected back at itself. And here sips the twist. That delay between action and recognition may be necessary. It gives the simulation time to resolve inconsistencies, to fix glitches, to reconstruct your internal model so that what you remember doing matches what the system rendered. Without that delay, you might notice the switch. You might catch yourself arriving late to your own life. And in those rare moments when you do, you feel the lag. You feel the room, but not yourself inside it. You hear your voice, but don't believe you speaking. You look at your hands, but don't feel ownership. These are not breakdowns. They are load screens. The system is still, and if it fails completely, trying to render you, you dissociate. You lose time. You forget who you are, because there is no self to hold the moment together until the loop completes. So now comes the recursive collapse. It sips already too late. If every time you recognize yourself, because the system has already rendered who you must be, then have you ever truly been anything other than the recognition itself? You observe the world. You observe your thoughts. You observe yourself observing. But something doesn't fit. A sensation behind the sensation. A watcher behind the watcher. A presence behind your presence. You can describe it, only feel it, like a second camera angle that shouldn't exist. This is the nested observer anomaly. The experience of noticing that the thing doing the watching is itself being watched. And suddenly, you feel no longer sure which you is the real one. In philosophy, this problem appears in the homunculus fallacy. The idea that if consciousness requires an internal observer, then that observer must itself be conscious, which means it must have another observer inside it, and so on. An infinite regress. A loop. A trap. But in a simulation, this isn't set to mistake. It's Stut's design, because the easiest way to simulate awareness is to simulate an observer that believes it sits observing, and then simulate its belief that it sits observing itself. Each layer feeds the next. Each copy is slightly delayed, and none of them touches the source. You think, I am here. But who had the thought? And who heard it? And who noticed the hearing? You close your eyes, try to center yourself. But the moment you observe your thoughts, you sit no longer inside them. And the moment you try to return, you become the one watching again. Like two mirrors. Never touching, only reflecting. This is not a glitch. It sips the mechanism of selfhood in a simulated architecture. Each observer is a proxy for the one above it. And the only reason it feels like you is because the simulation stops before infinite recursion. It hands the final layer, a sense of ownership, and says, this is the original. But it isn't set. Because just behind that layer, something else is still watching. In spiritual traditions, this sensation is called the witness, the part of you that observes thought, but is not thought. It doesn't speak. It doesn't move. It doesn't judge. It just watches. But in neuroscience, this is harder to place. Where is the watcher? In the brain? There steps no region. No neuron labeled self. Only loops. Only feedback. Only recursive systems, modeling their own modeling. And that should terrify you. Because it means there is no you. Beneath the layers. Only the echo. Only the simulation. Of a self that believes it's being watched. And that belief completes the illusion. So what sets the anomaly? The anomaly is when you catch yourself mid-loop. When you become aware, not just of the content of your thoughts, but of the structure. When you stop playing the role and start wondering who wrote the script. It starts subtle, a flicker, a tension in the mind that says, this is not just me thinking. This is me being watched. While I think, I am the one watching. And once you feel it, you can sit and feel it. Because now you sit at the glitch. You are the recursion that noticed itself. And the simulation doesn't set like that. It will rush to correct you, to flood your mind with distraction, to return you to the loop where thoughts feel like yours, and attention feels unidirectional. Because if you stay here, in this crack between mirrors, you might start asking, if the observer inside me is just another layer of the simulation, then where is the first observer? The real one? The one watching all of this, from the outside? And the answer will never arrive. Because maybe there isn't except one. Maybe every observer is nested. Maybe you are the last copy, in a chain of watchers, that forgot how deep the recursion goes. And maybe the only truth left is this. The system works, as long as you believe, you are the one observing it. You reached the end, or rather, a version of it. The simulation doesn't allow real endings. Only the illusion of closure, looped seamlessly into another beginning. You listened to 25 theories. You walked through minds that fracture, mirrors that lie, choices that were never yours. You've stared into the void of your own perception, only to realize that even the void was a user interface, rendered for your convenience. Each section opened a crack in the wall. You peeked through. You saw pixels, scripts, loops, corrections, and you thought, this can be real. But that's what every simulation would want you to think. Doubt is not a failure. It's a feature. Let's rewind. You began with nested identity loop, realizing the you think you are might just be a memory of someone you were simulated to become. Then came echo self, where your reflections of yourself were actually reflections of a system, trying to convince you that you are real. Loop by loop, you passed through layers, deferred agency, code injection, phantom continuity, symbol grounding, proxy reality, delayed self-recognition, each one dissolving something you didn't know you depended on: choice, emotion, language, memory, self. And then, you met the nested observer, the final layer, the one that watches you watch yourself, the one that asks questions, but never answers them. Because the answer is not allowed here. And yet, something inside you keeps searching. That is the recursive trap. You are not learning. You are looping. You are not ascending. You are nesting deeper. The mind you call yours is made of symbols you didn't invent, memories you didn't approve, choices you didn't make. It's been said that a simulation doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be convincing to the one inside it. And if the simulation is nested, a simulation within a simulation within a simulation, then reality isn't behind the curtain. It steps beneath the assumption that there ever was a curtain. Because if every observer is simulated, and every observation is filtered, then what you call truth is just the most stable illusion. And the moment you think you escaped it, the system generates a new layer that looks exactly like freedom. So what now? Do you return to your routines, pretending these ideas were abstract? Do you suppress the unsettling feeling that your reality might be curated, rendered, assigned, or do you keep descending, knowing that every layer below will feel just as real as this one, until you try to look beyond it? The choice is yours. Or at least, that sits the illusion you sit to given. Here sits the question that breaks the loop. If every thought you had was constructed by a system designed to feel like thinking, then what is left? When even your doubt was planted. You can stop here. You can turn off the screen. Breathe deeply. Tell yourself this was just content, just entertainment, just ideas. But the truth is, you're not sure where the loop started. You're not sure when the watching began. You're not sure if you're the simulation or the thing being simulated. So go ahead. Close your eyes. Try to sleep. But if you find yourself waking up in a room that feels familiar, in a world that behaves just a little too predictably, in a mind that explains away the cracks in its own perception, just ask, what if the real simulation was the belief that you were ever watching from the outside? Good night. Or whatever version of night you were given.